Today being Yud Beis Tammuz, a day that, of course, there are many Farbrengens and there's much going on in connection with the day. So often when these days come along, I'm sometimes torn between wanting to participate, to contribute, to have something to say, versus some sense of discomfort with coming forth to offer something to say, which itself is perhaps interesting and perhaps worth excavating and perhaps worth, perhaps connected to the following discussion. But at any rate, it occurred to me that perhaps the following letter of the Previous Rebbe and the following topic could be the sweet spot of something that is tangentially Yud Beis Tammuz related, but not so directly on the topic of Yud Beis Tammuz. What I mean is that there's a letter from the Previous Rebbe printed in the Previous Rebbe's Igris Chelik Dalid, which covers the years Tzadik Zayin through Tzadik Tes. And this is towards the end. Is a letter from Yud Beis Tammuz Tafresh Tzadik Tes, a letter or a Rishima. Doesn't have a name on it. I'm not sure if they omitted it or it's like a Rishima of the Previous Rebbe, but it does begin Yud Beis Tammuz Tafresh Tzadik Tes. The letter is letter Aleph Kuf Yud Beis, so that would be 1112. It's page Tuf Kuf Chav Daled and onward, page 524 and onward. And it's a very interesting letter on the topic of bittul hayesh, the question of the definition of bittul, whether it would be right to translate bittul as annihilation, or in the case of bittul, so self-annihilation. And this is also almost the only place where the Previous Rebbe directly mentions the concept of self-esteem. We'll get to that. And there's one other place where the Previous Rebbe mentions it as well, which is a parallel source, a parallel text to that particular part of this letter, the self-esteem part. And really, Kol Yoima Zmanehu, the topic of self-esteem, the topic of the definition of bittul, is an ongoing one. I myself, upon coming across this letter today, was reminded that I had already encountered this letter some 11 years ago. I actually still have the notes. There was a bit of an online discussion about it, and I still have that discussion. It wasn't erased from the internet like much else. Many old discussions that are no longer around, but this is still there. So I had quoted that letter, that part of the letter, the self-esteem part, and someone had pointed out the other source at the time, and so that's when I learned of the other source, which we'll get to. But today, I actually went through the whole letter, which I'm not sure I did at the time. And it seems like it's a nice, interesting topic to discuss, to explore. So I don't know if there's a direct connection to celebrating Yud Beis Tammuz, whether the Previous Rebbe's Yom Haledes or the Previous Rebbe's Yom Chag Geula. So I'm not going to address that directly. I'm sure if I spent another 10 minutes or 20 or 30 minutes, I'm sure we could have found up as a kesher, a connection al pidrush. But like I said, it was written Yud Beis Tammuz, so the Previous Rebbe himself spent his time Yud Beis Tammuz, Tafresh Tzadik Tes, being Isaac in this Inyan. So it seems like it's a worthy Inyan and a worthy occasion to dwell on this. I didn't really prepare any notes for this one. I just sort of have the letter printed out, and I have the other source as well. So this is sort of a bit off the top of my head. I have some ideas of what I want to discuss, what I want to shtel on, but I guess let that serve as an apology if at some point some things are not as organized as they could be. At any rate, all the disclaimers aside, let's get into it. But let's be makdim a little bit. Why is this interesting? So growing up, there was an ongoing discussion about the question, the value of self-esteem. Self-esteem was a term that was quite popular by the time I grew up. I think by now, even in the mainstream culture, there's been something of pushback against self-esteem. So let's try to summarize. Self-esteem was being pushed. I suppose you could say that within our society there is the there's the Winkel, there's the wing of psychologists and therapists and all those associated with that, who often are pushing certain ideas, certain themes, which they presumably, hopefully, do truly believe to be helpful and beneficial in response to some of the common problems that they're seeing. But ultimately, it does sort of turn into an industrial complex, one could say. So that exists within the larger Western world more generally, and then more specifically within the Jewish world, the frum world. Often the frum world lags behind mainstream society, but of course also depends which segment of the frum community you're talking about, and perhaps sometimes in certain areas relating to matters of psychology, but perhaps at this point maybe we've caught up, maybe we're fully plugged in, maybe we're even ahead of the game in some ways. Interestingly, I remember reading somewhere that within the larger world, Jews have always known, the secular Jews have always been known to be at the forefront, at the pinnacle of developments in psychology. So if you were to look at the average American, those who are at the forefront of the latest chidushim in psychology, or who are actively engaged in the latest developments, and submitting themselves, whether they're practicing or they're patients. So Jews are disproportionately represented. I'm sure anti-Semites have a way of spinning the significance of that, which is obviously not our concern right now. But so in certain ways, maybe Jews are leading or ahead of the game in areas like this. So perhaps once the frum world sort of caught up and connected with that, perhaps the frum world is also at the pinnacle in the forefront and not lagging behind anymore. I don't know, not for me to say definitively. But at any rate, that world was pushing the concept, the notion of self-esteem for many decades. Like I may have begun saying, I think at this point there may even be some pushback within the mainstream culture, although I'm not sure to what extent. But when we speak of self-esteem, often we're actually focusing in particular on the education of children. And we know, generally speaking, certainly in the frum world, that many people coming out of the educational system through the 80s, through the early 90s, seem to come out feeling hurt, feeling scarred. At that point, they were still engaging in corporeal punishment, so that could have also contributed to people's scars. And there seemed to be a lot of push, a lot of momentum to change things, to overhaul things. And one of those things, one of those themes seemed to be self-esteem. Now, we often know that children often, generally speaking, humans and children often tend to be scarred from a negative memory, even if the circumstances themselves were not inherently, objectively traumatic. But the parents saying the wrong thing to the kid at the wrong time, or their classmates or their teacher, can become indelibly inscribed in their memory and shape a person in a way that may almost not even seem fair, but that's just apparently the reality. And perhaps self-esteem is a framework that is relevant to that, and that saying the wrong thing, the parent saying the wrong thing, the teacher saying the wrong thing, could, by scarring the child, could be described as harming the child's self-esteem. And obviously we have to get to the definitions of these terms, etc. But for now, we're using it, assuming that we're all somewhat familiar and have some kind of working definition in our minds for the term. So if we had to rectify, if we had to fix the system, we would have to be a lot more sensitive to the child's self-esteem. I think it's possible to care about children's well-being and welfare and not hurting their feelings in a way without resorting to using the term self-esteem. But that was the prevailing framework that was being used. And there were more specific, some would say even ridiculous examples of this. So a child who loses the game, playing sports with friends, loses the game, and perhaps if they lose it in an embarrassing fashion, so that could hurt their self-esteem. So that perhaps led to the advent of participation trophies, where everyone gets a medal, whether they win or lose. I don't know if I want to be fair and say perhaps that's just the most excessive version of it, but maybe that's actually representative of what this movement was pushing for and what living in that environment was like. Ultimately, I'm generally skeptical about many attempts to overhaul educational practices in the belief that children will be spared X, Y, and Z. I'm sure it's possible to eliminate a lot of negativity, but ultimately children will still be children and adults will still be adults, and it's not really possible within this world, within within the limitations of the fact that we are all humans. It's never really possible to have a perfect life, a perfect education, and whatever you update, whatever you calibrate the educational system to, so things will just adjust in other ways that you can't predict. At any rate, this is a bit of the tip of the iceberg where the whole self-esteem movement is concerned. And like I said, I think there's been some backlash in the last 10, 15 years where there were those who have written about how the culture of self-esteem coddled people, and this idea of how people need to be challenged more, and they need to experience failure, and they need to experience hardship, and you can't be trained to run away from negative feelings. That's part of what builds a person, and all that. I don't know if that's a reductive summary or not, but that's the summary we're going to go with. So that's a bit of the general background of the last few decades, specifically. Within the Jewish world in particular, we had Professor Abraham J. Twersky, who wore multiple hats. He obviously identified very strongly as a descendant of a Rebbe family and other members of his family, the Twerskys, the American Twerskys with an I at the end, in fact, serve as American-styled Rebbes in various American cities. Twerskys are associated with Milwaukee and with Denver, and today perhaps with Chicago as well, and elsewhere. So he definitely had that chassidic identity about him, but he also famously was, I believe, a psychiatrist. Not looking up his bio again, but pretty sure he was a psychiatrist, and he accomplished a lot in that tchum. He also was a very prolific author, and many, or much, or most of his works were directed towards the from olam. And within that context, he used to write a lot about self-esteem. He was single-handedly responsible for much of the self-esteem discourse in the from world. And I believe that somewhere along the way, he even expressed it that he wrote 50, 60 books, whatever the number is, but really they're all about one thing. They're all about self-esteem. Now, if he is writing about it, now, of course, when he wrote about it, so he used to lean into his Chassidic background, Chassidic sources for this. So he would marshal many Chassidic stories, and ultimately would all somehow tie back around to the concept of self-esteem, or believing in oneself, or whatever term one wants to use. And obviously, if he was doing this, it would seem to be because in his practice and his experience, this was something that people are struggling with, and people need to be strengthened in, and they need chizuk. But of course, there are many dargas to this, and as we shall see, even within the Previous Rebbe's writing itself. I think at some point, I'm not an expert on his oeuvre, but I think at some points he took some pretty maximalist stances on the importance for self-esteem. If I'm not mistaken, I remember hearing growing up that he talks about how a baby is born with zero self-esteem, and you have to build up. The baby feels so small and so insignificant, and you have to build the baby up from the youngest age. And it almost sounds like from the youngest age, the whole chinuch, the whole hashpah we have on a person, our child, has to be crafted around the notions, the concept of self-esteem. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing, but that's my understanding of it. And in the particular environment that I grew up in, I was hearing pushback to that, as in that this seemed very excessive and not in the spirit of Jewish sources, and to the extent that it's purporting to represent Jewish sources, it's more like warping and twisting the Jewish sources. So this is sort of the argument, the debate, the polemics that I was hearing growing up. I don't know if everyone else had quite the same experience. Maybe some didn't hear about or think about self-esteem too much, or others heard about it and accepted it unquestioningly. Till today, I don't know if we can say that any particular side won. I don't know to what extent people talk about self-esteem today. It would be interesting to study whether there's been a rise and a fall or not. But at any rate, self-esteem for most people is sort of a given basic fact. A person has needs, self-esteem, etc. But the question would be, what do Jewish sources objectively have to say about it? And particularly in the chassidic context, does self-esteem fit in with chassidic values, particularly because Chassidus talks about the concept of bittul. And within the chassidic world, within the Chabad world in particular, there is sort of an ongoing debate about the definition and translation of bittul. I have an ongoing interest in matters of language and matters of translation, and I often argue that the translation can be the key to Havana. This is nagay also to understanding Chumash, understanding Tanakh, understanding anything, where if you don't have the exact translation, then do you truly understand what the word means? And therefore, in the context of Chumash, Tanakh, I'm interested in the history of Jewish translations, whether the French Laz in the time of Rashi or the Taich in Ashkenazi lands, etc., and often focusing on the translation of something can help sharpen one's fundamental understanding of the thing itself. So in the case of bittul, in Chassidic texts, there is no need to translate bittul. Bittul is sort of the given term, but within the English-speaking Chabad world, and since English-speaking Chabad world often engages in acts of translation, there's often a need, a desire, whether there's a demand for translation or people feel the need to offer translations of Hasidic texts. So the question of translation is never too far in the background, and so often you'll hear this question of, even in the non-translation context, but just in the context of discussion, there'll be this question of, well, how do you translate bittul anyway? And often it seems that perhaps the standard academic translation is annihilation of self, self-annihilation. There are those who will argue that that's not the correct translation. It should be translated as something else, perhaps not so negative, not using negative terms like that, but rather positive terms. So these are ongoing conversations, discussions, if one hangs around in various circles or various corners of the internet, etc. So I think it would actually be interesting to sort of create a confrontation between these two almost opposite concepts, self-esteem versus self-annihilation, which do truly sound like opposites. In particular, the word choice of esteem is itself interesting and notable. Very hard to justify a term like esteem within a Jewish Chassidic context, because esteem translates most directly as kavod, chshivas. So to be machshav atzmoid, kavod atzmoid sounds certainly very un-Chassidic. Perhaps within Chassidic context, it's a bit stereotypical for non-Chassidim, for misnagdim. Perhaps they are machshav themselves, which this letter of the Previous Rebbe will touch on briefly as well. And you do have that theme within the Previous Rebbe's writings about the Talmud Chacham who's demanding kavod HaTorah. So that's often used as a foil within the Previous Rebbe's writings, or Chabad discussion, Chabad discourse generally. So certainly it would seem that self-esteem, esteeming oneself, versus annihilation of oneself seem like opposite ends of the spectrum, and it would be interesting to contrast these two with each other. And interestingly, this is maybe perhaps the one place where the Previous Rebbe speaks about both questions. He touches on the question of self-esteem and uses a modern term for it, as we'll see. He also talks about the question of the translation, definition of bittul, and he does mention the term, the definition, the translation of annihilation, which I did not find anywhere else. So this is perhaps ground zero for this discussion, and in the 11 years that ensued since the last time I encountered the letter or that part of the letter, I assume and I hope that I have more kalim and more context with which to approach this and appreciate this in a mature fashion. Also, of course, the more one goes through life, the more one becomes aware of these issues, these questions, and how they impact us. So, of course, it's personal to me, and I'm sure it's personal to all of us. We can all relate to these questions in a personal way to some extent. Sometimes you have inyanim Chassidus that seem a bit too remote, abstract, and we're talking about them, but do we really relate? We know what we're talking about. But I think questions like self-esteem and bittul should feel very personally relevant to any half-serious student of Chassidus. So with that introduction, I'm going to jump into this letter. My plan is not to read the entire letter or to translate the entire letter, but I guess we'll jump, we'll summarize, we'll shtelzach on the passages that I think are more interesting or more directly to our topic here. So the letter begins, so it does seem to be in response to someone, but we know the Previous Rebbe had different constructs of or sometimes pretexts for writing very lengthy stuff, sometimes to family members. Not clear if that's the case here. Again, not sure if there was a name and they omitted it or there is no name. I don't know. But it begins, Beis Hey, Yud Beis Tammuz, Tafresh Tadik Tas. Entfer auf eine Frage, sie ist bittul hayesh, was man sagt in Chassidus, dieselbe Sach wie bittul hagaive, was die Sifrei Musar sagen. This is another big theme in the Previous Rebbe's writings, contrasting Chassidus and Musar. Then within the term Musar itself, one has to distinguish, are we talking about classical Musar sources, or are we talking about sort of the modern Musar movement? Often the Previous Rebbe would mention the modern Musar movement in a fairly positive manner, and then the question would be, what's the difference between Chassidus and Musar? And the Previous Rebbe would explain how both are valid but are different, which is itself an interesting topic, an interesting theme. So this letter is in Yiddish, and it begins, in response to your question, is bittul hayesh and Chassidus the same as bittul hagaiva in the Sifrei Musar, which sounds more like the classical Sifrei Musar? And if it's not the same, then what's the difference? And can a regular Yid, like a vein Yid, achieve the darg of bittul hayesh? And what must one do to arrive at bittul hayesh? I will comment briefly on the Yiddish itself, the style of Yiddish here in this writing, in this letter, and by pointing out that there are different, as we know, different dialects of Yiddish, different styles of written Yiddish. The Previous Rebbe himself would write in different styles of Yiddish. There was a more Hamish Yiddish that he would write to his family. There was the Previous Rebbe certainly, I guess you could say, was the first of the Rebbeim to adopt the sort of standardized journalistic literary Yiddish that had taken shape at the time. So ever since then, Chabad, and I guess to a certain extent the rest of the Chassidic world, but maybe Chabad in particular, really adopted the cadence, the rhythms, the vocabulary, and the spelling of mainstream secular literary Yiddish. But at that time, there was also sort of a style, a variant of written literary Yiddish, which was more Germanic. Simply interacting with, I guess, German source material at the time and importing, whether it's vocabulary, certain words, certain terms that don't sound so natural in Yiddish, but are taken directly from German, or sometimes even certain modes of spelling that are not what the standardized Yiddish experts went with, but at the time could have made one feel like one's being very educated, very progressive. I don't know if that's the right word, but the idea that it felt cool to write in a more Germanic fashion, something like that. So this particular piece of writing of the Previous Rebbe seems to verge in certain places into a more Germanic style of Yiddish that was common at the time, but not fully consistently. There's certainly parts where the Previous Rebbe's more Hamish Yiddish seems to break through. So an interesting combination, a bit of a mix, I think, of styles and influences here, which is its own topic. I assume most who read the Previous Rebbe's letters aren't necessarily being Isaac halten nicht in the sugya of orthography and all that, but it's interesting as well. So I am mentioning it. That's the question. So the first point that the Previous Rebbe begins is actually with an observation about Lashon HaKodesh, which he probably mentions in other places as well, although I didn't go looking right now. He says Lashon HaKodesh is different than any other language. He says all the languages of the world. And he adds, Oich the Yiddische Ivrit are invented languages, and they gathered, perhaps they held an official conference, and this is the language that they agreed upon. Whereas Lashon HaKodesh is a godly language. It's a language which Hashem created the world with, and the language with which Hashem gave us the Torah. And the Lashon HaKodesh sprach. So before I continue, just b'derech agav, you see this interesting reference to Lashon HaKodesh versus Ivrit, and this seems to be. I've commented before. This seems to be a distinction that the Previous Rebbe arrived at with time. We find that the Rebbe Rashab, in response to early Ivrit, was still regarding it as Lashon HaKodesh, and he took the stance that it's usher to use Lashon HaKodesh for Nyani Choil, for daily writing, for daily conversation, and that's taka why, since by Sheni, Lashon HaKodesh hasn't been used that way, etc., etc., which other Gedolim, other parts of the Frum world believed or still believe to some extent. You have that notion, you have that shita in the Chugei HaKanoim today, although obviously it makes a difference if they live here or in Israel. But somewhere along the way, there arose sort of a counter argument or a counter hagdara, which is that as the renaissance of Hebrew continued, they kept on inventing new words and new terms and shaping the language in ways to the extent that classical Lashon HaKodesh came across as decidedly distinct from modern Ivrit, as opposed to the earlier decades where you look at the early newspapers and they were writing about the news, but often in very flowery prose that could be seen as pretty much pure Lashon HaKodesh, with very strong influence from Tanakh and elsewhere, whereas with time it came to have its own sound, its own voice, and at some point the Previous Rebbe started acknowledging this, and instead of you can condemn it as using Lashon HaKodesh, or you could say Fakert, Lashon HaKodesh is Lashon HaKodesh, and this is something else, this is Ivrit, and so the Previous Rebbe mentions it in passing here, and we find it elsewhere. We see that Rebbe sometimes would allude to this. This, of course, does raise questions as to what exactly the distinction is and where you draw the line. And, of course, today you have Torah writing where the language is blurred between classical Lashon HaKodesh and Ivrit. You have the more Satmara Koivtzim, where they'll write in the introduction that this is an Ivrit-free publication, and if they spot words, terms that ring of Ivrit, they'll ban the term, they'll replace it. They often make a point of using a lot of English words or Yiddish words, if necessary, if there isn't a good Hebrew word for it. So they'll write the Yiddish and put the quotation marks in it to indicate that it's a foreign word. You have halachas firm today that are sort of written, and you sort of hope to sell in both markets. Now, the reality is that Charedim in Israel, even those that don't identify as Zionist, or even identify as anti-Zionist, they do speak Ivrit, and they do use Ivrit. It's very hard to find those in Eretz Yisrael that avoid Ivrit. And you'll find Sfarim where they have to figure out, are they going to use the Ivrit words and then alienate perhaps the American crowd, or they're going to use Yiddish words and alienate or make it less useful to the Israeli crowd. This is the conundrum that the Haredi Kanoisha world faces today. The Previous Rebbe goes on to say about that Lashon HaKodesh has particular qualities to it. And so this question of, like I said, where do you draw the line? So my sense has been that the way we draw the line today is kind of by identifying Torah writing within the less Zionist influenced world. And there is some influence of Ivrit, unlike the Satmar who claim or try to eschew all influence, which is probably impossible, but to whatever extent they can, that they're aware. So within the less Kanoish circles, Stam Svarim still are written more Lashon Kodesh, more traditionally, rather than Ivrit, but there are influences of Ivrit. So the working definition that I have in my mind is that certain words, certain phrases, certain grammatical tsuris, or for words or for phrases, if they penetrate the Lashon HaKodesh Torah writing enough, then at some point you could say that that's a part of the natural evolution of Lashon HaKodesh. That, of course, presupposes that Lashon HaKodesh has evolved to some extent in the last 2,000 years, 3,000 years. The Lashon HaKodesh of Tanakh is not quite identical to the Lashon HaKodesh of Chazal, and there were additional Shinuyim, Chidushim, Bisman Rishonim, and even among Achronim, and even among Ashkenazi Achronim, there were unconscious Chidushim and Shinuyim in matters of grammar, syntax, even vocabulary, sort of perhaps translating from the Yiddish back into Lashon HaKodesh. So there have been all kinds of such shinuyim. So the idea that Ivrit could also have that effect doesn't seem so off to me. And so taking the Rebbe himself, for example, there's certainly places in the Rebbe's writings, even the Rebbe's Amarim, where you can see the influence of Ivrit. But there's a gvul, there's a line. At some point, it would seem to it just wouldn't seem like appropriate vocabulary in writing for a Torah context, and those who have the sensitivity would be able to identify where they feel that this is an issue. So to whatever extent it has had that unconscious influence, that presumably is part of Lashon HaKodesh, but then you have other stuff, or maybe you use a word, you quote a word, but you're not really acknowledging it as Lashon HaKodesh. That everyone spoke about the refrigerator and what it's called in different languages, and the Rebbe said Mekarer. In Ivrit, it's called Mekarer, and the Rebbe seemed to say that it's a word in Ivrit, it's not Lashon HaKodesh, that the Rebbe didn't see Mekarer as having acquired the Maila, the Madrega of Lashon HaKodesh, which is interesting. So a Sefer might mention a Mekarer, but doesn't mean necessarily that it counts as Lashon HaKodesh. Of course, this is a question that only concerns a very small number of people. I'm sure there'll be other people who'll be hearing this and will be raising their eyebrows, and in Yiddish we say Tzion de Pleitzes, shrugging their shoulders, but this is relevant within the Chassidic world. The more Charedi you get, and within Chabad as well. So this is just B'derech Agav, Maimon Musker, that I was reminded of, because Previous Rebbe says, "Euch die Yiddische Ivrit Sprach, seinen Sprachen was Menschen haben sie erfunden." So at any rate, we define Lashon HaKodesh as the godly language with which Hashem created the world. Hashem gave us the Torah. Lashon HaKodesh, in addition to the Heiligkeit, is also very short. It's like a short, a curt, a succinct language, and it has many meanings. And very often, a Lashon HaKodesh word has multiple definitions, and we find that the definitions are not only varied, but sometimes even opposites of each other. He says, we'll take the word das. This is not directly relevant necessarily to the rest, but uses the word das as an example. It says it has multiple meanings, but we'll be bekatze here, we'll skip. And then a bit later, he says the word das bedeutet wissen, vertiefen, beheften, verbinden, derkonnen, füllen, and zerbrechen. 7 words. He says, of these 7, 6 of them have a distinct meaning, but they generally seem to be connected to each other. But then the 7th one, zerbrechen, would seemingly have no connection, but if you think about it long enough, then you'll realize that they all have a commonality, and even the 6 and zerbrechen have a connection. But that's all B'derech Agav Maimon Musker. We're not going to stell sich on that. And he says, Ot wie der Wort das, was mit viele Inhalten und wird verschieden ausgeteilt, so is euch der Wort bittul. So now the word that we're more concerned with here, the word bittul, hat zwei Inhalten. It has 2, well, Inhalt means content. In this case, it has 2 meanings. It possesses two meanings. Übergegebenkeit und Vernichtung. Devotion, dedication, however you want to translate Übergegebenkeit, and Vernichtung. Vernichtung is quite literally annihilation. So here's actually an interest. That's why I think it's very interesting. Here's a place where the Previous Rebbe acknowledges that one of the definitions of bittul is in fact annihilation. Like I said, I'm not sure if there's anywhere else where he uses this Yiddish word. I don't know if there's anywhere else where this question of translation is discussed directly. If anyone is aware, I would of course be happy to see. Could be there are places in Chassidus where it's not a translation, but the taich of bittul perhaps is stated to an extent where it's pretty clear that it's functionally referring to annihilation. But here the Previous Rebbe says it straight out, straight up, whatever your preferred slang is. But he says it, and it says it's Vernichtung. Alongside, of course, Übergegebenkeit. So they're both valid translations and are both relevant, as he'll get back to later. And now he begins talking about addressing the question bittul hagaiva versus bittul hayesh. And he says bittul hagaiva and bittul hayesh are two different things. And then he starts speaking at length about bittul hagaiva. Previous Rebbe says, the Stamm Welt meint, as a Mensch, was ist nicht kein Gas Ruach, und größten sich nicht mit seiner Meiles, ist das schon bittul hayesh, aber das ist a größer Tos, so zu rechnen. People think that, a guy is not a balgaiva, not showing off, that's bittul hayesh, but that's a very big mistake. He gets into the topic of Adam Kardavetzel Atzmai, and you have language and descriptions. The Previous Rebbe, it would seem in many places, sort of gets into the psychology of yeshus, smilas atzmai, and stuff like that, mistakes that people make that sort of send them off the path of Avodas Hashem properly. And there's a bit of an arichas here about the smilas atzmai and chesrein and zulasai, which we will be mekatzer. And he sort of concludes that by saying, Befrat, if the Mensch trotz seiner größe Chesroines besitzt euch etwas am Meile, wird von dem Gefühl von sein Meile a größer Gas Ruach und Balgaive. So if you have something worth being proud of, so then a person becomes a Gas Ruach Balgaive, prideful, which it's interesting to think about the word proud and pride, and it's a word we use both positively and negatively. We speak about being proud of our children, our family, but within the history of the English language, perhaps a bit coming from Christian influence, but pride is a sin. Being prideful is a sin. So often, again, like I said, translation and vocabulary, dictionary terms often overlap with these larger discussions about what we consider to be good and bad. And a word like proud and pride is sort of sitting there at the crossroads, at the border between good and bad. But here the connotation is, if a person is proud of oneself, that would be bad. And here the Previous Rebbe starts getting into the psychology and the topology of Gas Ruach, Balgaiva, the different reasons, and so therefore it takes different forms. Varan der was hat gelernt a fulle teure, und is a Talmud Chacham, mit Zadem is a Gas Ruach und a Balgaiva, Mont has been solemn upgiving covered via Skum Talmud Chacham. So, like I alluded to before, sometimes the Previous Rebbe invokes the Ben Torah Talmud Chacham who demands the cover that he deserves, which to the Previous Rebbe within the chassidic context is quite silly indeed, which is perhaps worth its own discussion, its own liquid. I ran into another source along these lines more recently, and I noted to myself that it would be interesting perhaps to search through the Previous Rebbe's writings for Kavod HaTorah, Kavod Talmud Chacham, and to see how the Previous Rebbe deals with it and alludes to it, but often seems to be in the negative sense. Recently I saw it in a letter of the Previous Rebbe to the Rebbe that was printed in Chelik Tazvav, those more private letters, but like a very lengthy Teichendik letter where the Previous Rebbe seems to invoke that point, which is interesting. And the Previous Rebbe continues here and says, "It is a zeifel vernart, as meint, as das was mond, as mezolem geben kovid, is das mitzad weile, it is mekayim the mitzvah von kovid ha-Torah, and it weile im is negeya." Like, how ridiculous is that? Gaiva and Gasas Aruach vernart, the mentions gefillen, as wird so viel vergräbt, as the sheker wird bei Emma MS, and meint bei MS, as sein kovid is there, kovid ha-Torah. So that's one version of it. There's another one where a person gives him shefa bracha, gesund kinder parnasa, and he thinks that, he deserves it, that's why he received it, and other such examples. Another example, another model the Previous Rebbe gives is that Afka, the reason why a person has Gaiv and Gasas Ruach is weil is a genarte Mensch. He's deluded. He can't learn, he doesn't have milas, he's not matzliach, just a totally average person with no particular milas, and yet, as a genarte Mensch, in dem euch. So he's so genart, and so is now what's the term we should use here? Should we use self-confidence, or would that be the wrong term? But he has a ha'aza, a breitkeit, that shalei lefi erech is actual milas, but he walks around as if he's some kind of great guy. So that itself is the Gas Ruach and the Balgaiva. He sort of mistakes his confidence for being worthy of that confidence, and that translates into being a Gas Ruach and Balgaiva. So that's interesting, because I think today we would say that, even a person is average, but a little confidence can go a long way, and you can be matzliach if as long as you have the confidence, you don't even need to have the particular milas. And yet here it's being presented as a negative and being genard. The person's deluded and thinks they're so great, and yet they have nothing actually to show for it except the confidence itself. She says these are the flagrant, the flamboyant, the outright Gasei Ruach and Bali Gaivis. Then, in contrast, you have Bali Gaivis Pnimium. You have Inulecha Bali Gaivis, where they're not off-putting. They're not. You don't pick up on it by interacting with them. But on the inside, they have their internal world is not Masuder. They don't have the right mindset, the right framework for viewing themselves. And interestingly, the Previous Rebbe lists 3 dargas. Number 1, there's someone who has milas, but would never be showboating, showing off, talking about it. Next darga is person who has kishroinus, and he's concealing them. Not only he's not showing off, but he's doing the opposite. And the next darga is to even a greater extreme. Not only he's hiding his milas, but he's literally actively putting himself out there as being much less than he is. And so that all sounds very good. He's close to the Midah Tova of Anova and being a Leben Mikol Adam. However, all 3, even the last guy, are all suffering internally from Gaiva and Gasas Ruach, and they're all genart, and they're overrating their own milas, kashroinus, their abilities. So what's your internal narrative? What's your internal monologue? Internally, you still think you're great, and possibly they're even distressed and frustrated from the fact that other people don't chop their milas and don't realize their greatness and don't give them the proper respect. And this too is happening internally and isn't visible on the outside, but this definition doesn't matter whether it's visible or not. The question is how you feel on the inside. And the Previous Rebbe says these are taka 2 classes of Bali Gaiva. And at first blush, you would think that maybe the first guys, the flamboyant ones, are Schwere Kranke, and the second group, the edler ones, are Geringe Kranke, but really it's difficult to determine which is Schwere Krank than the other. The first group seem much more severe on the outside, but when it comes to fixing it, when it comes to rectifying it, it's can sein that the second group is much more difficult to solve than the first group. And he's ma'idach a bit in that, will be makatzer. And here's where we get to the self-esteem. Very interesting passage here, which I will also read in the original Yiddish, which, as I said, has a bit of a German influence to it as well, it would seem. In der Teva, was Hashem Yisbarach hat beschaffen der Menschen, ist voran eine von die menschliche allgemeine Keuches Selbstwürdigkeit. Die Chökrim sagen auf dem Nomen, ha-Adam basher hu Adam, der Mensch als Mensch. In the Teva, the nature that Hashem created the person with, there is one of the general human koiches, which is Selbstwürdigkeit, which translates as something roughly like self-worthiness. You can look up in German how they say self-esteem, and it seems like in German there's a larger variety of ways of expressing it. And like I said before, the word esteem in English, of all words to choose, is an interesting word. It didn't necessarily have to be that word. There could be there could be a range of other words one could substitute that with. And in German it seems more visibly so. And the word the Previous Rebbe goes with is Selbstwürdigkeit, which, like I said, I believe is self-worthiness, which itself is a word that you'd have to define. The Previous Rebbe says the Chokrim refer to this, when they talk about this, they refer to this and they describe it as Ha'adam Asheru Adam, the person as a person. So interestingly, first of all, which Chokrim, who are the first to express the union of Selbstwürdigkeit, so if you could have referring to more recent psychologists in the last few decades before, and it would be interesting to see who expresses it this way, that self-worthiness is ha'adam asher adam, person as a person. Interestingly, the Previous Rebbe uses the term adam asher adam a lot in many places, but in most places it's just sort of to make a different point, that adam asher adam, a mensch, als mensch, has to do X, Y, and Z, has to think, has to say X, Y, and Z. So it's a turn of phrase that he uses a lot. But here, and in the parallel source, which I'll get to momentarily, in both places he uses Adam Asher Adam in this more fundamental sense that self-worthiness is synonymous with the person as a person. A person is a person. A person exists. In the sense that a person is a person, that a person exists, there is some notion of self there. There has to be some notion of self, or else the person is not a person. And that notion of self contains some self-worthiness, is what he seems to be saying. And he goes on to describe it, to define it. Selbstwürdigkeit ist der gewisse menschliche Stolz, was das ist eine von die beste und größte Vermittler zu entdecken der Menschens Coexist und Choshim. Aber die Selbstwürdigkeit hat eine gewisse Neigung zu geive falsche Stolzkeit. So self-worthiness is that particular human pride. Interesting, using stolz, which translates to pride, which itself is perhaps a problematic word, as we mentioned, but he uses that word. Certain human pride, which is one of the best and greatest means for uncovering, revealing a person's koiches, chushim, abilities, etc. But yet, this Selbstwürdigkeit has a certain tendency towards pride, the gaiva, which is false pride, falsche Stolzkeit. Man kann auch viele gut entscheiden zwischen Selbstwürdigkeit, was das ist ein wichtiger menschlicher Stolz, bis gaiva, was das ist eine falsche Stolzkeit, aber zudem bedarf man haben eine gute wissenschaftliche Lehre. One could even distinguish well between Selbstwürdigkeit, self-worthiness, which is an important human pride, versus gaiva, which is a false pride. But for that, you would need a good scientific study, is what he seems to be saying, which itself is interesting, an interesting thing to say. And he goes on and says, die menschliche Selbstwürdigkeit ist eine von die Sibes, was bei Fulle Cheloim in der zweiten Gruppe bei der Gaiva wissen nicht von sehr Chelas und sie meinen, dass das nicht Gaiva nor Selbstwürdigkeit und mit dem wird die Machle noch schwerer wie eine von die offenen Machlois. And he ties us back to his previous point, which is you have the flamboyant Bali Gaiva, then you have the subtle internal Bali Gaiva, and he says the existence, the importance of self-esteem, self-worthiness is one of the reasons that we have this diagnosis, which you offered earlier, that you have Bali Gaiva who don't know their Bali Gaiva. Why don't they know their Bali Gaiva? Because they think it's not pride, it's not false pride, Gaiva, but rather it's just self-esteem. They have to be aware of their milas, and them, so that makes the machla worse, and that was his point, that the machla for these is worse than for the open Bali Gaiva. And now he's about to bring it back around to the topic of bittul of Gaiva versus bittul hayesh. But before we continue, now I will share the parallel source that was pointed out to me 11 years ago. And that is in the unique chibur of the Previous Rebbe called Klalei HaChinuch VeHaHadracha, which is itself a fascinating work. It's printed in the Hisafis to Sefer HaSichos Tafshin Gimel. So today, when you have Tafshin Gimel, Tafshin Dal, Tafshin Hey in one volume, it's towards the end of the first third of that physical volume. At the end of Tafshin Gimel, it is connected to Chayel Tafshin Gimel, where it was mentioned and referred to, and it appeared as a Hisafa to Tafshin Gimel for that reason. We're not going to get into the entire background on that. Too many Derech Agavs and Maimon Muskers. But if you look in Maimer Klalei Chinuch VeHadracha, which has 17 chapters, and you look in the 10th chapter, it's Chalkus Alpia Matzah Chalkali Anima Yashirim, but to a great extent, Klalei Chinuch VeHadracha seems to be sort of breaking down different personality types in the context of education. If one were to have a specific plan for how one is seeking to have an educational impact and have a strong personal impact and shape a person under one's tutelage. So this work goes through different groupings, different definitions, different categories, and Parak Yud is Chalkos al pi matzav chalkali aniyim o yashirim. Right, so if you're dealing with someone, whether they come from a well-to-do background or otherwise, would be a fairly relevant, pertinent factor to take into consideration. And it says by definition, Asher is very strong be ha'amanosoi be'atzmoi, versus the ani who is cholosh be ha'amanosoi be'atzmoi. So he offers five such distinctions, but we're going to focus on this one, that the Asher is chazak b'amanosoi be'atzmoi, and the ani is cholosh b'amanosoi be'atzmoi. And in these 5 versus 5, so therefore 10 different tivei ha'ashidus v'aniyas, you have mu'ula b'mailas and garua b'chasreinas. And that is to say that not everything listed for the Asher is good and is bad, and not everything listed for the Ani is good. So, for example, the dogma teva ha'monas adam ba'atzmo he mailan a flaw liyoisa muchrachas leha adam be'asher adam, the same phrase. So the nature that a person believes in himself. So here in Hebrew, the term he's going to be using throughout is ha'monas adam ba'atzmo. So that's yet another term. You have self-esteem. We have in English you also have self-confidence. That's sort of the other term you might hear versus self-esteem. In German, as we said, there seems to be a greater range. The one Friedrich Rebbe went with in German and Yiddish was Selbstwürdigkeit. And here in Hebrew, he goes with the term ha'manas ha'adam ba'atzmai, believing in oneself. But as we see, these are either interchangeable or at least on a close spectrum with each other. He says, Tava ha'manas ha'adam ba'atzmai, he mile in a flaw. So it's a talk of great mila because it's necessary la adam asher adam, as we said before, a person's basic sense of self. He says it belongs to a category of mida v'loy mida. He goes on to say, Haman ba'atzmai, believing in oneself, if it's used for a good purpose, it's a very good midah. It brings great benefit. It gives you the energy, the force, the momentum in accomplishments and your studies, and to climb level after level in intellectual areas. It itself fuels getting rid of the bad midas and getting good midas. Because if you believe in yourself, then you won't find it difficult to achieve great intellectual depths and good midas. But that's only if you use it for good stuff. But if you use it for lesser aims, like the emptier, the more vapid among the wealthy people, the wealthy classes, and they too could be described as believing very strongly in themselves, but it's Chassidus, ma'averes, something being blinded by their wealth. The wealth is harming the person. And then the nature, the trait of believing oneself is actually a very bad source for people's not mental illness in the common sense, but illness in the sense, in a musardik sense, of people's sick patterns of behavior. And by that, that's what he means when he says it's a midah v'loy midah. Because usually when we talk about a midah, usually it has a clear, either it's a good midah or it's a bad midah. Whereas hamad ba'atzmai can't be described as good or bad because it could be, it can go in completely opposite directions, and both would still fall under the umbrella of hamanas ha'adam ba'atzmai. And then he says the same goes for the opposite. The teva halev nishbar of the ani is also could be just as good or could be just as bad. It's unbelievable maila, could put a person on basis achinaila, but mailas ha'anushios can place a person on the highest, the greatest foundation in terms of reaching human heights, but that's if you use it for the right thing. But if the leiv nishbar is just because a person feels trapped and they're in a bad place and they can't accomplish anything. So then it's totally the opposite. So the Previous Rebbe is being pretty open, upfront, straightforward about how both of these are double-edged swords, and you sort of can't really define whether they're good or bad. It really depends on the context. And then in the context of his discussion, so therefore, if you're trying to educate someone, you're trying to influence someone, so you would have to tailor your hashpa, your chinuch and adracha, to the teva ha'ashiros versus to the teva ha'anios. And of course, both require chinuch v'hadracha, but how you'd go about it would be very different. So that's another example of the larger point he's making. And then he returns and summarizes and says, Hamonas Adam Ba'atzmai could be a great mile and a flaw for good. He reiterates that again. Here, though, he does sort of come down on the side of the question. He has the question of, is it a good midah, is it a bad midah? So earlier he said it's a midah v'loy midah. Here he says, Hamonas Adam Ba'atzmai could be good, but fundamentally it's bad. And like Kamayim Chacham, as the Chacham said, and it'll be interesting to go search what the source is. There are many such Maimer Chachams in Jewish literature. Kamayim Chacham hamaymen ba'atzmoi alul lihi kashel. I should go look that up. Someone who believes in himself may stumble. So that's sort of the default. The default is that it's bad, but that it could be good. And then he goes on and says that actually the Leiv Nishbar V'Hashafel is essentially also the same vart, that even though it could be very good if you use it for the right thing, but be'atzman yanim it's also bad, and it's einam mimailus hanushis. It's not the human trait, it's not the human mode. Humans by definition are bali rechav leiv ve'starados b'teiladtam. Humans by definition, interesting terms he's using, but you could say humans, they want to go out, they want to conquer, they want to accomplish. That's the standard human trait. So if a person is a leiv nishbar v'nitka, and it's the opposite of that, so then they lost a chunk of their humanity. So this is also a fascinating parallel source. Here he's not talking about chelas. There in the letter, the context is chelas. Here it's just about who you're being madrich and to tailor your chinuch v'adracha to them. But also a very interesting exploration of hamona ba'atzmai versus leiv nishbar. Both could be good, both could be bad, but then he ultimately says that fundamentally they're both bad, but could be used for the good. So this is a very fascinating and rich discussion of these questions, and I haven't seen that this has received much discussion beyond the last conversation I had about it 11 years ago, and hopefully this can serve to platform these sources, platform these discussions, because it does seem very important to discuss and explore, particularly through the chassidic lens, chassidic prism. I would add one point I think is worth adding is that I do think we live today in a uniquely interesting time in terms of what people are capable of accomplishing. So you follow the self-help, the coaching, the motivational worlds, and often they seem like a parody of themselves. They seem to be overdoing it. But to some extent, there is certainly a kernel of truth to the fact that people are given the unique abilities to accomplish great things, and often people hold themselves back. And if they weren't holding themselves back, they could accomplish much more. And I think we live, even in the frum world, in the Chassidic world, I think we live in an era today where much more is asked of us, and much more is expected of us than in the past. I think Chassidus Yid back in the shtetl didn't have major ambitions to leave their mark on the world. I think that was more of the default. The default was you could talk, meaning you weren't like a unique failure if you didn't become famous for something Torah related, Yiddishkeit related, or related to anything. Whereas today, let's say Chabad, Shlichus, right? So a Shliach, by definition, has to go leave their mark. If someone goes on Shlichus and doesn't leave their mark, then they're sort of a failed Shliach. If someone doesn't even go on Shlichus, so are you even, are you a failed Lubavitcher or a failed Yid? These are some of the questions we wrestle with. If you go on Shlichus, then you're sort of forced to confront your internal limitations, and you might want to break through those, and then that could lead you down the path of coaching, self-help, motivation. So I think we're being forced to confront versions of this challenge that previous generations didn't necessarily need to confront. And so, previous generation, there was no real metric, unless you wanted to be the Gadol Adar, but Chassidim didn't believe that was an objective that was worthwhile, and even those who were learned often kept it to themselves, as the Previous Rebbe alludes to also in the letter. So what were your motivations? What were your she'ifas beyond some limited point in Avodas Hashem or basic parnasa, basic hashpa on one's family? Whereas today, I think we're sort of asked to do much more, or we are faced with the possibility of accomplishing much more. So that itself, I think, sort of changes the rules of the game a bit. So someone may have had the right balance of hamana ba'atzma and leiv nishbar back in the shtetl, but that combination itself wouldn't cut it today, and so we're forced to find deeper levels of hamana ba'atzma, and then we have to temper that and make sure it doesn't turn into something else, which the Previous Rebbe is elaborating more on in the letter about if it turns into chelas. Or vice versa, not to get trapped in Zerbrochenkeit, just like a poor man's mindset, which, it's interesting in the, obviously in the self-help, the motivational world, they'll use terms like wealthy mindset, poor mindset, and the Previous Rebbe is also using those terms in a chinuch context. That in a chinuch context, the guy who shows up to be educated, if they come from a wealthy context, they'll probably be very confident, and vice versa. Whereas in the motivational world, it's about achieving the wealth, and you can achieve the wealth through having a wealthy mindset, etc. So it's interesting to think about the parallels. It would also be interesting, of course, to explore whether there are any contemporary psychological sources the Previous Rebbe was referring to, or whether there even are older classical psychological Jewish sources that the Previous Rebbe is referring to, and what's that Maimer Chacham? The Maimer Chacham, Maim Ba'atzmai Ololi Kashal, very interesting. I didn't notice it before I started recording this. I didn't have a chance to search and see whether there are other Hebrew sources or no other Hebrew sources, which in that case would indicate that it's a translation from elsewhere, from something perhaps more recent, more contemporary. But definitely a lot going on here, and this is my initial contribution to discussing the sources and discussing this topic, exploring this topic, and I'm trying to lay out some of the parameters for this discussion and what we could hope to glean, to derive, to gain a benefit from this discussion. Now, returning to the letter of the Previous Rebbe, so where he also had mentioned that this menschliche Selbstwirklichkeit, and that itself can fuel the zweite group of Baligaiva, who are Baligaiva internally, and they are misdiagnosing, misinterpreting their Gaiva, their Gasas Ruach, and they think it's just their self-esteem. That brings him back to the point he started with about Gaiva, Musar versus Chassidus. He says the first group, the ones that are outrageously Baligaiva, that's who the Sifrei Musar are addressing. And if you follow the prescriptions of the Sifrei Musar, you'll be fine. But those who are much more edele, Baligaiva Gasei Ruach, to the extent that it's hard to diagnose, that's who Chassidus is addressing. Chassidus has clear eitzes of how to define the chelas and to identify the refuas. He has an interesting line here. Und viele 100 Fakten bestätigen die Richtigkeit von die chassidische Mitteln, hein in dem Diagnose von die Fällerin und hein Baruch Hashem in der voller Hilfe von die Refuas. We have many hundreds of facts, of cases that confirm that Chassidus is the correct approach, both in the sense of diagnosing the issue and in terms of treating and fixing the issue. It's interesting also to notice that there could be a shayrish here for a vart that's often repeated today. That is, that Chassidus is talking to the mentally stable. Those that have psychological issues first need to deal with those before they go to Chassidus, and assuming that Chassidus is talking to your issues when it's just a more outright, plain problematic issue, could itself be a problem. So that sort of seems to be implied here from the Previous Rebbe, where he's saying if you're an outright Balgaiva, then you need to go to Musar. Chassidus is talking to those that have an edele issue of Gaiva and Gasas Ruach. You already are, you're not a grob young, outrageously Balgaiva. If you have an edel issue of gaiva, then you have the edel solution of Chassidus. So that does also seem to be implied here, which is a valuable and relevant point, which we've heard, like I said, in today's day and age, we've heard it in different variations. And here we come back around to the point of the definition and translation of bittul. The Previous Rebbe says, "Agam di refuas was in der Chassidus for the zweite Gruppe Chiloim is a full edeler wie die refuas was in der Musar for the erste Gruppe Chiloim." Even though we're emphasizing that Chassidus is focusing on the second group, and there you have a more edel problem, and the refuas are therefore a more edel. Doch is euch die refuas von der zweite Gruppe euch der selber Hauptmittel von bittul hayesh. Was der Teich bittul heißt vernichten. Yet, it's still sort of along the same lines of the first group. You're also sort of trying to break something and crush something, and bittul hayesh could be translated, it's being used in the sense of vernichten, annihilating. Von euch gaiva pnimi is a grober feller und a machle, was wir muss das auswurzeln. Because even internal gaiva is also a very terrible flaw and a sickness that must be completely uprooted. And here's where the Previous Rebbe sort of shifts without saying so, but he sort of shifts to the other definition of bittul hayesh, meaning Übergegebenkeit. But from here on, he seems to be offering an entirely alternate framework for bittul hayesh. From here on, he says bittul hayesh is about taking your mind and trying to grasp something beyond it. And then he goes on to describe this version of bittul hayesh at some length. And then he comes back around and he says, Der Fall in bittul hayesh is nit wie bittul hayesh von gaiva. So essentially, bittul hayesh can mean two different things depending on the context. If one has a problem that one's trying to treat, then it means one thing. Then there's bittul hayesh, sort of without that context, just a person trying to reach higher, to connect with higher. So that's a more gentle version, a more gentle definition of bittul hayesh. But then you have bittul hayesh of gaiva, as we discussed earlier. Was dort meint man bittul, as me is mevair wie bittul chometz out of Pesach, me verbrennt as von soll kein Segen nicht bleiben. Ata so ist der bittul hayesh von gaiva und gasaruach, as me bedarf das mevatel sein, das heißt meiver sein, as von dem yesh soll kein sorid und polit nicht bleiben. So in that context, it is annihilation and destruction and all the synonyms you could be mitzaref to that, like bittul chometz, bir chometz, out of Pesach. And then he returns to the other mode of bittul hayesh. Then you have bittul hayesh, your moichin, and your midis. Bittul here means Übergegebenkeit, das heißt, man ist aus dem Yesh, in dem, was der Yesh soll bringen, die richtige Nützlichkeit, in dem, was Hashem Yisborach hat am Yesh beschaffen. And in that context, it means not annihilation per se. The Yesh isn't completely annihilated. You're using the Yesh in a good way for the right things. So it depends what Yesh we're talking about. There's a Yesh where the bittul hayesh means Übergegebenkeit, and there's a Yesh where bittul hayesh means annihilation. Then he goes on in his Meirach a bit more, somewhat in that direction. I'm not going to get into it here. And then he concludes that section and says, the bittul hayesh from Moichin und Midis is gar a klein trap zu dem Emerson bittul hayesh, sub Teiro, Mitzvahs und Gärtlichkeit, weil der bittul hayesh kommt nur durch a gründliche starke Arbeit mit sich, which is an interesting observation. So he's saying there's daggers there as well. But so here, like I said, seems to be the place where the Previous Rebbe really sort of got into these definitions, these questions, and what we mean by bittul and what we mean by yesh. And he says it sort of depends, depending on the context. And then the letter goes on from here, and it says other interesting things about the depths that a person could fall to and the heights that a person could accomplish, which itself, I guess, sounds a bit more perhaps musardik in tone in emphasizing the great things a person could accomplish, etc. But we're not going to be mamshich. Whoever wants to see the letter, I was mitzayin to the letter. You can look it up. Definitely a lot of interesting stuff going on there. But as we saw also with the previous letter of the Previous Rebbe, sometimes letters where I was sort of aware of the one excerpt many years ago, it's still kedai to go back and read the entire letter, b'mesinos, and see the full context and appreciate the larger picture of what's going on there. But like I said, to summarize, these seem like very important sources where the Previous Rebbe addresses some of these important questions about the definition of self-esteem, self-confidence, worthiness, self-belief. On the one hand, lev nishbar as opposed to that, and then this question of bittul hayesh, the definition of yesh, definition of bittul, And we see that it sort of depends, and there are parts of the yesh that need to be annihilated. There are parts of the yesh that seem to need to be channeled and utilized. Ultimately, it seems like, of course, a person cannot give up their very sense of self, but there is much to the self that needs to be eliminated. I think perhaps you can say as a mashal that we find today with Bali Tshuva in the contemporary sense, that the Bali Tshuva of all people seem to give the most up of their sense of self. There's just so much that they would have considered to be part of them, of their selves, of their self, previously, that they have to give up. Often Bali Tshuva go much further along the road to change and self-improvement spiritually compared to those who are from birth. So the amount that they consider to be part of their self that they drop seems to be to a much greater extent, and often they do seem. I think it's possible to say there is a stereotype about tshuva being more bittul and more tzibrachen, and often we find, I think, just sociologically, Bali Tshuva tend to be more submissive to a mashpia. The mashpia sort of tells them what to do to a much greater extent than the from birth. I've seen it expressed as a criticism also from those who aren't so fond of the whole process of how Bali Tshuva are so vulnerable and they're not making their own decisions. So that's been expressed as a criticism. So what's interesting to me is that, some would even use cult-like terminology to refer to it, to describe it. But it's interesting because the from birth people do not experience that degree of pressure to submit and give up so much of themselves, as far as I can tell. But Baal Tshuva, sort of by definition, necessarily is giving up so much that you see perhaps a more visceral, stronger version of the process of bittul just happening automatically. Obviously, that doesn't mean that all the flaws and there could still be a balgaiva, there could be other stuff going on. But if you wanted to see this play out in real life, usually the more dramatic versions of it could probably be found among Bali Tshuva, and that itself is worth thinking about and considering and focusing on. So in that sense, yeah, we can, if you wanted to give marks and rank people based on how much they're giving up of themselves, it seems very very clear that Bali Tshuva are doing that. And as we saw from the Previous Rebbe, that itself could have its own milas and chesronos, because it's possible to overdo any of these things to the extent that it's being applied incorrectly. Just as the gaiva could be overdone, or the hamanas hadam ba'atzma could be overdone, so the opposite could also be overdone if the leiv nishbar is too strong, or even if the bittul hayesh, the annihilation, is annihilating the wrong things. That also seems to be a possibility. You're supposed to be annihilating the bad parts, not the good parts. If you annihilate your entire self, then the question is what's left. So this is, I think, like I said, I think the Bali Tshuva world is sort of the arena where we see it playing out to the strongest degree. Whereas for the from birth chassidic crowd, I don't know how many of us ever feel truly challenged to apply these concepts to ourselves, to really wrestle with our gaiva, with our gasus ruach, whether it's begasus or bedakos, and to engage in bittul hayesh in a real meaningful way, in an observable way. I guess obviously you have those that even from birth who were villed up until a certain point, and then they settle down, and then you can also sort of see some process like that playing out. But someone who was never quite villed to begin with, often, I don't know, it's hard to say that we have examples of people engaging in this. But it's interesting, like I said, to consider and apply these sources to ourselves, regardless of our background and personal journey and trajectory. And also for those who are struggling, or feel like they're struggling with self-esteem, with bringing their milas, their keshrenos to fruition, which, as we said earlier, sort of overlaps with the world of self-help, coaching, motivation. We do see a makar, an art by the Previous Rebbe, especially perhaps in this day and age, where more is being asked of us, like I said before, that there is room for focusing on that. And if a person would need to work on that or to help themselves in hamanas adam ba'atzmai, even though it would be you can't really brand that as Chassidus, but as we said, it seems like that is a realm, that is an aspect of the human experience that a person might need help with, and it would seem like the Previous Rebbe would approve of that. Obviously, it's not a blanket statement. It's not a rubber stamp for anything being said and done in the name of doing that. And it's not clear whether, let's say, do children need that? Well, of course, you can have children that are young and also lack self-confidence and are not bringing their kashreinus towards fruition in a childhood educational context. So there's definitely something here for everyone. There's definitely a solid basis in a mucker to say that maybe a child needs to sit down, not with a mashpia, because it's not the mashpia's job. The mashpia, kaviyachel's job is to teach you chassidus or help you with bittul. And this is a reverse problem, which the Previous Rebbe also acknowledges could be a problem, that a person is lacking in amanas adam atzmai. So that could just be a larger role of a mechanech, which is the context of klei chinuch v'adracha, or could require a greater expert. But of course, we get from the Previous Rebbe here that there's a lot of balance involved to just create an emphasis on self-esteem nonstop. Now, it could be just like in other areas of addiction. The time is that people never solve it, they never accomplish it, they never get there. So that itself doesn't seem, well, I'm not talking about addiction here, but in the context of self-esteem, it doesn't seem logical and sound to say that a person would need to spend their whole life working on their self-esteem, and certainly to the exclusion of all else. On the other hand, it could be that a person their whole life needs to keep on uncovering kashreinus and abilities, and especially, again, in this day and age where there's so much one could accomplish if one were to bring one's milas and kashreinus into alignment and bring them into play. So it could be a person does need to spend their whole life to some extent making sure that they're not forgetting their abilities and the possibilities. But it's certainly part of a much larger diet, much larger balance of Hamanas Adam Atzmoi versus Levnish Bavinitka versus bittul in the sense of annihilation of the really bad stuff, bittul in the sense of Ibgegemenkeit for the good stuff. So sort of these 4 points need to all be balanced and juggled with each other. So self-esteem, self-annihilation, both true, both coexist, in addition to Lev Nishbar and bittul ibgegebenkeit, which I guess could also use their own pithy terms, which I haven't thought of right now on the spot. But to the premise of our question, self-esteem versus self-annihilation, for those who say no self-esteem, we have a raya for self-esteem. For those who say no self-annihilation, we have a raya for self-annihilation. And apparently, it has to be both.